if you discuss the influence and the role that foreigners have had in Koryo history, on Koryo society, on the Koryo state, you have to discuss the role that international trade played, the role that merchants played. Because this is probably one of the most important ways in which foreign influences were entered Koryo and were internalized. And also an extremely important way in which Koryo influences went abroad. Koryo is famous still today for its porcelain, its celadon, as you can see here, which it exported with great success all through its existence, mainly to China, but it reached many different parts of the world. And one of the ways in which this porcelain was exported was by way of the traders that came from the Song state. So the state that had unified the Chinese mainland in 960, and which was always an important presence to Koryo. But interestingly, and this is something which is not always realized sufficiently, if you ask me, it's a state with which Koryo, for the most part of its existence, did not have any formal relations with. And this is something I would really like to stress. Koryo was smaller than either Song China or Liao Manchuria, the Khitan state on the Koryo's northern neighbor, which meant that in a diplomatic relationship between these states, it would be kind of inevitable that Koryo would recognize the superior, at least numerical strength of the other dynasties. And it did so, but it couldn't do that both with Song China and with Liao Manchuria, so it did that only with Liao Manchuria. It recognized the Liao Emperor as its suzerain. So the Koryo ruler recognized that the Liao Emperor, in terms of at least diplomacy, was one step above himself. In practice, the Liao did not try to interfere with Koryo, and when it did twice in invasions, they were certainly the second time soundly beaten. But there is a very strong ritualistic, perhaps even ideological, but certainly political and diplomatic hierarchy there. Now, the important thing here is that the formal relationship of Koryo, as a smaller country, slightly smaller, with Liao, that was the only formal relationship that Koryo, for the most part of its existence, had. So until the Liao would disappear, and we'll get to that later in the first half of the 12th century. So there were no formal relations with Song China. Now, why is this important? Because there is a very strong emphasis on the influence of Song China, political, cultural, literary, well, you name it, on Koryo. Now, is this influence then also a fantasy? No, there is a very strong influence, or an array of different influences on Koryo from Song China. It's definitely true. Sometimes it's exaggerated, but it's there. Now, one of the ways that this didn't express itself is through direct official diplomacy and politics. But there is another way of seeing these relations is through trade. And that's where you cannot say but that the relations between Song and Koryo were extremely dynamic. So there were Song traders living in Koryo, and there were Koryo traders living in the Song. Per year, ships with hundreds, 2 or 3 times a year, ships with hundreds of Song merchants would arrive in Koryo. And they wouldn't do this if there wasn't anything for them to make money with, if they couldn't earn a living. There's one, and it also went the other way. There's a famous anecdote of the first half of the 12th century, after the Liao dynasty had disappeared and the Jurchen Jin dynasty had appeared. At a certain moment, on the other side of the Yellow Sea in Song China, people were afraid that they were going to be invaded by the Jurchen. And they spotted this large fleet of over 100 ships, and they were completely sure this is the Jurchen fleet that is going to invade. This is war. Now, what it turns out to be were Koryo merchants with 100 ships. Maybe there's a bit of an exaggeration involved there, but this tells you something about the vibrancy and the dynamics of this relationship, and also the trade volume. We don't have really any really hard numbers, but this tells you that 100 ships, that's not nothing. The important thing I would like for you to take away from this is this, that in the absence of a diplomatic relation, there was nonetheless a very vibrant and long-lasting commercial relation between the Song and Koryo. Now, this wasn't all good. It wasn't that everybody was just very happy with this as long as money was made. The merchants would be happy on both sides if money was made, but politically this was also seen as a problem precisely because, as I explained to you before, Koryo recognized the Liao Emperor and it didn't formally recognize the Song Emperor, which meant that for Song, Koryo was always a potential enemy, a possible threat. And in a very influential Song politician, scholar, official like Su Shi or Su Dongpo, that's his pseudonym, wrote basically warned the court, the Song court, for Koryo, criticizing that they were mercenaries. They just wanted to earn money, and you can see this reflected in Song policy also, because at a certain moment a ban comes into existence on what Koryo merchants could buy and could export in Song to Koryo. And one of the things that, for example, was impossible for Koryo merchants to buy, even to see, was maps. Because Song was afraid that these maps would lead to a military advantage if it would come to war between Koryo and the Song, or between Koryo and the Liao, because Liao and Koryo had such good relations by this time. It also meant that the number of merchants in Song, Koryo merchants, were restricted. Not everybody was allowed to trade with the Song. On the other hand, such restrictions, to my knowledge, did not exist in Koryo, although I imagine that if Song merchants would try to get to lay their hands on Koryo maps, that the state would not be amused. Song traders were extremely important from the beginning of the Song dynasty, 960. Koryo had been in existence for almost 50 years then already. But also until the end of the Song dynasty and its relations with Koryo. But they weren't the only international presence in Koryo. There was a large, or large-ish, we don't really know exactly how large, but there was an important presence of Muslim traders in Koryo as well. And Muslim traders in the Muslim community probably had been there for quite some time, because there are references in Arab works, one written in the 10th century 9th, 10th century in Sicily by an Arab geographer that references Shila. And Koryo is also mentioned later on in other works by Arab and Muslim geographers. There is even an epitaph or a stele with an inscription found of a Muslim in Guangzhou, so this is China, during the Mongol period, in which he is described as a Koryo-in, so a Korean, a Koryoan. Whether he was of original Koryo indigenous ethnicity or whether he was a part of the Arab community or perhaps Uyghur community that had been living in Koryo for some generations by the time is not clear. But it does tell you something about the importance of other kinds of merchants in Koryo. And the fact that the inscription for his grave was in 2 languages, in Arab and in classical Chinese, also tells you something about apparently how this was possible, how normal this could be. Although this is the only example I know from the Koryo period. But then again, the Koryo period is known for its lack of sources. Not much has survived the period, unfortunately. But the Muslim traders in Koryo before the Mongol invasions of Koryo were important. They had been there since the Shilla state and since Greater Shilla had been in existence. And of course, this has something to do with the fact that Koryo really is the last stop on the Silk Road, if you don't count Japan at least. Koryo is the last stop on the Silk Road, and Shilla had been that last stop before. There are grave excavations from the Shilla period have turned up European glassware, for example, from that period. So there were trade relations between Europe and Koryo and Shilla not directly used perhaps, but indirectly. And I think the Muslim traders, the Arab traders, played an important role in that sense. But not just commercially, but apparently also socially and even literary, because one of the most famous extant Koryo songs, the Turkish bakery shop, Sangwajom, deals with a Turkish bakery in Koryo. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, the importance of the population of Muslim traders and Muslims in general grew significantly with the advent of Mongol rule. Basically because the Mongols opened up Koryo, they conquered it, they made it part of the Mongol Empire, and by doing so made it part of a very cosmopolitan, internationalized empire, in which it was much more common than before to have foreigners in your country. People you would before have seen as foreigners, you would now see as the same subjects of the same Mongol or Yuan ruler. I guess the example I just mentioned, the Muslim administrator from Koryo with a Koryo background called Ramadan Alauddin, is one of the is a prime example. He was from the Mongol period. And this is not something which was only known in Koryo. This is also something that was known among Arab chronicles and among Arab geographers as well. What you can see now is a quote from a 12th century book that describes Koryo, or as it is called here, Shila. At the furthest end of the Chinese territory lies the land called Shila. Whichever Muslim or other stranger enters it, settles in it, and never leaves it on account of its pleasantness and excellence. Much gold is found there, which may be a reference to the fact that the Shila capital at the time was called Kumsong, Golden City. The influence of Muslim traders, of the Muslim community, went further than just being a commercial influence. It was also social and literary, as I mentioned before. And this is a translation of the Koryo song, in which it is very clear that there is a strong and apparently important and also apparently quite normal, because it has been there for a long time, presence of the Muslim community in Koryo. Now, I've talked about the trade with the Song, which was extremely important in terms of commercial interest, but also in terms of civilizational exchange between the two countries. Many books would also travel with the merchants, not just goods that made money, but also ideas, books, things like that. I've talked about the presence of Muslim or Arab traders in Koryo, whose presence was long-standing, and it would survive the Koryo dynasty. It would survive until at least until the 15th century. But I didn't talk about what I think may even have been more important than these two different streams, if you will, of trade, and that's the trade with the Jurchen and Liao, or the trade with Liao through the Jurchen. And I've mentioned in a previous lecture how important the Jurchen were in their role as middlemen with the Song, but certainly with the Liao. The problem is that we know that many Jurchen entered Koryo. We know that they came regularly, we know that they came to trade, but we don't know how much was traded. To a certain extent, we know what was traded, but that's about it. And that makes it very difficult to precisely, or even unprecisely, measure the importance of the Jurchen trade. Also because, and that's the ambiguity I think I referred to in the previous lecture, is that so many Jurchen were Koryo residents, it kind of blurs the lines between foreign trade and internal domestic trade. And the fact that not many records were left really doesn't help. But I think that if we take a look at the entire picture of trade, international trade in Koryo, we can come to the conclusion that yes, the trade with the Song was very important. Through the Song trade, the Sinitic influence was very important, but there were no formal relations between Koryo and Song. Even though at a certain moment Koreo's perhaps most successful and certainly most long-reigning king, King Munjong, who ruled over what probably is the best or the most, well, the blossoming of Koryo culture and the blossoming of state and society. He was somebody who wanted to re-establish relations with the Song Emperor, but basically his minister said, no, we're not going to do that. The Liao is more important to us. It means that Sinitic influence was very important, it was formative, but there was more. So there was also Manchurian influence. There was influence in a different way from the Muslim Arab community in Koryo. The point I would like to make here is that if you put everything together, is that the influence of the Jurchen and the Liao and later the Jin, and the Jin is basically the name of the state that the Jurchen would establish after they had taken over the Liao in 1115, that they as partners and as, I guess, counterparts in the civilizational dialogue between the different states and societies were as important, and I would not exclude the possibility that they were perhaps more important, but at least as important as Chinese states. Now, I think I've come to the conclusion of what I wanted to say, and I would like to wrap that up by going over the keywords once again. And these are these keywords. Song China, an extremely important presence in Koryo society, for the Koryo state, in terms of commercial relations, in terms of intellectual, literary and other cultural influences. Diplomatically, however, this is a very different story. For most of Koryo's existence and for most of Song China's existence, northern and southern Song, Koryo did not have relations, official relations with the Song. International trade is in a very important way of looking beyond in the presence or the absence of diplomatic relations, because diplomatic relations can only tell you so much. International trade can tell you much more on top of diplomatic relations. But let's be very clear about the fact that the formal diplomatic relations of Koryo were with Liao. They recognized the Liao emperor as their suzerain. In practice, this didn't mean very much. Diplomatically, politically, or ideologically, it did mean something. It also meant that there was a constant state of paranoia, certainly in Song China, with regard to Koryo. And that was reflected in the way Koryo and Song China dealt with each other, which is why there was the Koryo Trade Act was enacted in Song, which made it more difficult for Koryo merchants to trade with the Song. And then, of course, two other important influences, the Jurchen, the middleman in everything, who were also big traders with regard to Koryo, and the Sanghwajom. So the extant song in Koryo, one of the few songs that are extant, that explicitly mentions the Arab Muslim community's presence and I guess indirectly their influence in Koryo. And I think with that I'll conclude this lecture.